We are with Professor Emeritus of Social Ethics, former director of the Catholic Jewish Program at the Catholic Theological Union, Professor John Pawlikowski. He was appointed in 1980 to the United States Holocaust Museum Council by the then President Jimmy Carter, and reappointed on the same position by Presidents George Bush and Bill Clinton. Undoubtedly a great personality, a great figure in the fight against anti-Semitism and in the work for dialogue between Jews and Catholics. So, my dear John, the first simple question, how is that you became so committed with that which was called before the Holocaust the Jewish question? How is that suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, the Jews and the anti-Semitism and the dialogue with the Jews became a special issue in your life?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join in this conversation. I would begin, actually, it might be a bit surprising, with a childhood experience. I was raised in the shadow of a very large Orthodox Jewish synagogue in Chicago. And many of the shops surrounding us were owned by Jews. And for example, the Jewish bakery did its best business on Sunday morning after the masses at the Catholic Church. But I also had, on the corner of the street where I lived, there was one of these, what they used to call mom and pop grocery stores. And they had a soda fountain. And after school, a number of us would gather there for perhaps an ice cream or a drink of soda or something. And it was there that I began to have a certain relationship with a young Jewish lad, Orthodox, who lived about a block away from myself. And we used to meet quite regularly within the mom and pop shop. But then I never could quite figure out that as soon as we stepped outside of the store, it was like he didn't know me. We never actually exchanged names and so on. So there was a very friendly conversation while we were in the store, but only later do I have some understanding perhaps why he was hesitant to be seen with me outside of the store. But anyway, that was a bit of introduction. There was an interesting relationship between the local Jewish community, as I say, mostly Orthodox. My maternal grandmother would spend quite a number of hours sitting with her Jewish lady friends on the parkway that was a block from our house and where the synagogue was located. I also, there were interesting kind of personal exchanges on the parish church to which I belonged and where I went to school was a kind of on a U plaza. And in one corner was a Jewish nursing home. And in May, when we had the traditional so-called crowning of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is usually a colorful event, they used to invite the people from the nursing home to come out and watch it. Now, you know, that wasn't theological discussion. That wasn't any kind of conversation on the Jewish question, as you put it. But there was a certain human exchange to what my grandmother experienced in her conversations on the Parkway, what I experienced with my friend in the store, and so on. So I think in a way that I would say that in the end, that kind of primed me early on for a positive view of at least Jewish people who lived more or less in the same neighborhood as I did. More professionally, my interest really began when I was in the seminary. My religious order, the Servites, had a seminary in Lake Bluff, Illinois, and that's where I attended. And of course, I was in the seminary during the Second Vatican Council, and when the document Nostra Aetate was being developed. And one of my professors there, at that time a member of my order, now subsequently he left, and professionally he's has been a major scripture scholar named John Dominic Crossan. But he was one of the first professors anywhere to take a strong interest in what was happening with the document Nostra Aetate. And he gave one of the first lectures about the document within probably a week or two after it was formally approved in the last session of the Vatican II. And in a sense, he kind of took me under his wings, and really was a inspiration on beginning to confront the issues raised by Vatican II in Nostra Aetate, and particularly the distortions of Jews and Judaism that were so frequent in Catholic teaching and so on. When I went to the University of Chicago for my doctorate, I had two professors who played a very important role in really leading me to concentrate in a very central way on Christian-Jewish relations. One was the church historian Martin Marty, who had a significant interest in the more contemporary Christian-Jewish encounter. He was quite familiar with the writings of people like A. Roy Eckhart and other pioneers, particularly on the Protestant side. And the other person was a biblical scholar named J. Kurt Reilersdam. He had been at one point a missionary in Arab countries, I believe in Iraq, but then went on to become a professor at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago in the Hebrew Bible. And he was one of the early pioneers on the Protestant side in Christian-Jewish relations and rethinking Christian-Jewish relations. And both of them had a very significant influence on me and my thinking on this subject. And finally, I would say two other things. First of all, Father Edward Flannery published his groundbreaking volume, The Anguish of the Jews. And that really began to filter through wider Catholic public. And I think Father Flannery managed to put the issue of anti-Semitism on the table of certainly American Catholicism and even beyond. And that was motivating for me as well. That book had considerable impact on me as when I first read it. So the final kind of initial influence was I had been writing some very, very short pieces for a publication sponsored by my order. It was a publication associated with what was called the Sorrowful Mother Novena. And actually that publication, at the time I was writing for it, had the largest circulation of any Catholic publication in the United States. That magazine collapsed very quickly when the Novena pretty much collapsed. But several of my short pieces that I devoted to Catholic-Jewish relations were brought to the attention of a person who worked at the Anti-Defamation League in its Chicago office, Hans Adler. He was I wouldn't call him he left Nazi Germany just while it was still possible to get out. So he wasn't a survivor of the Holocaust in that sense. But he saw my writings and he called me down for a meeting to his office to see if somehow we could work together. Also, Rabbi Mark Tenenbaum, who was then head of interreligious relations for the American Jewish Committee in New York, and also, I believe, the only official Jewish observer at Vatican II. The AJC had received a substantial grant from the Ford Foundation to do a study of textbooks in the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities, in which each of the communities would examine their textbooks in a scientific way regarding the image of other religious traditions and so on. And the Catholic study was done at St. Louis University in 3 parts by 3 Catholic nuns. And Rabbi Tenenbaum wanted to further, because the studies themselves were sort of filled with technical educational jargon. And so he wanted something a bit more popular and so on, based on the findings, but nonetheless presented in a less jargony way. And he invited me to New York to discuss this publication. We settled on the fact that I would be doing it, and eventually that was my first major book, Catechetics and Prejudice, which really brought me face to face, especially on in terms of the Christian Catholic-Jewish relationship with the long history of anti-Semitism. So that's kind of a brief history of what brought me to, the point where I became deeply involved in Catholic-Jewish relations to a degree locally, but especially nationally and internationally.
It's an outstanding synthesis of your life. And I use this word synthesis because you began telling us your sentiments, or the root of your feelings about Jews through your experience with Jews in your youth, and all the evolution until you reach the maturity to work in such an outstanding way on dialogue and anti-Semitism. Now, I have 2 questions after this extraordinary introduction. The first question is, why again anti-Semitism in our present, throughout the world, and For our great sorrow, I am living here in the United States, and I identify a lot myself, of course, with everything that is going on around me, around us. Uh, why again a wave of anti-Semitism? Why Pittsburgh? Why all the attacks against synagogues, against the community centers? Why again? How do you explain? How do you understand, if it's possible to give some kind of explanation of understanding on what it's going on in our days again with anti-Semitism?
Well, I don't think any of us can give a full-fledged answer to that question, because there are anti-Semitism is taking on a different manifestations, and therefore it has many many parents, if you want, in the contemporary situation. I would say, as a Christian, I think the legacy of specifically Christian anti-Semitism still continues to play a role, even if people are not so conscious upfront of that history. I think the seeds of Christian anti-Semitism, which were really largely planted by the church fathers, by people like St. Augustine and others, who said that Jews were not, in the case of Augustine, that Jews were not to be killed in the way that the Nazis wanted to kill Jews, but they wanted to make them perpetually miserable and marginal, and with never a homeland of their own, and so on. And people, I just had dinner with some friends, and in the conversation, we got on the subject of anti-Semitism and Christian-Jewish relations. And it's just amazing how unaware even fairly educated Catholics are still of the tradition of specifically Christian anti-Semitism. And I just always mention to people like that, did you ever hear of the plant, the Wandering Jew? The name of a plant. Yes, the woman said to me, but how did that come about? How did that plant get the name Wandering Jew? Because of this longstanding patristic tradition of what is sometimes called in Latin, the adversus Judaeos tradition, the against the Jews tradition. It permeated. Now, I've often been asked, and I really don't have an answer. Why did the church fathers really develop what, on the whole, was a very vitriolic attitude towards Jews in the first few centuries of Christianity? Because I don't think you can argue that that is so deeply rooted in Scripture. Yes, in the Gospel of John, you have these references to Jews having the devil as their father, and Jews being associated with darkness. And certainly those passages did leave an imprint, I think, on early Christian consciousness, and frequently were misunderstood, because Scripture scholars today would tell us that some of that language was really more internal Jewish conflict rather than Christian Jewish conflict. As we know, Second Temple Judaism, and Judaism, which included the time Jesus was doing his ministry and so on, really was a time in which there was a great plurality of viewpoints in the Jewish community. It was a time of new birth, new ideas, but like often happens, this produced internal clashes, just as we're seeing deep-seated internal clashes, say, in the Catholic community today, in the organized Catholic Church. So, those seeds were planted, and they have never, in my judgment, they have never been formally removed from Catholic teaching in the way that I believe they should be. Yes, we have had important statements from various bishops' conferences, especially from, let's say, the bishops of Germany, bishops of France, and so on, and other countries, even the bishops in the United States, and so on. But if you take the most important, I suppose, statement from the Universal Church, dealing with anti-Semitism and how that anti-Semitism impacted the development of the Holocaust, which the 1998 statement from the Vatican, we remember, you see the limitations. Yes, the church officially was to say those were wayward Christians. They followed false teachers in their attack, but you can't really say that. I remember being on a visit to Strasbourg, France, and actually some years ago, I was giving some lectures there, and I took the opportunity to do the official tour at the famous Strasbourg Cathedral, where you have on the outer facade this image of Judaism and Christianity in stone. And there, Judaism and Christianity are presented, in the case of Christianity, as a vibrant young woman holding a book of the Gospels and so on. And Judaism as a kind of bedraggled, bent over old woman holding a broken Torah, kind of a broken Torah. And that just was deep-seated. Now, did that always lead to hostility and anti-Semitism in a sense? No. I mean, my grandmother could have delightful encounters with the Jewish ladies her own age on the parkway outside my home. But I often say that if social tensions were to arise, I wonder how long that very positive encounter would remain. Because one of the things we see in autobiographical accounts of Jewish survivors, especially Jewish survivors, say from Germany, where there supposedly was this more open-minded view of Jews and Judaism, and how quickly, how shocked they were, because they thought they had really solid relationships with their Jewish neighbors. Oftentimes, a Christian family would hire a Jewish music teacher for their children and so on. There was social interaction, and all of a sudden, it was like, in a way, similar to the experience I had with my 10-year-old friend at the mom and pop grocery. There was a positive relationship when we were inside, but suddenly it changed when we went outside because of sort of a prevailing legacy, I think, of anti-Semitism. Now, I certainly make some distinction between classical anti-Semitism and, say, the Nazi form of biological anti-Semitism, which had many, many roots beyond the Christian tradition. But then there's a kind of mysterious part to this too. Sometimes people will use the language of anti-Semitism without Jews. You have anti-Semitism where there are no Jews even present, or hardly any. And I think that's the certainly for any of the societies that have been historically impacted by Christianity and the Christian tradition, that those seeds are still there. And while the 1998 Vatican statement did help, and I do know that the most controversial parts of that document, such as statements that the majority of Christians saved Jews during the Holocaust, which is patently false, were due to pressures on Cardinal Edward Cassidy, who was then responsible for the text of that document from the so-called Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which said either he changed certain statements in the proposed document, or they would not allow the document to be published. And so, quite reluctantly, and I myself had private discussions with the late Cardinal Cassidy on this, he recognized the inaccuracy of some of these, but felt that overall the document would have a positive impact, and agreed to some of the controversial statements that are in there, and which I and others have critiqued. So in some sense, I think there is yet not on the international level of Catholic Christianity, but I would say Christianity as a whole, a really clear-cut and absolute repudiation of these seeds of anti-Semitism, which were put there in the first place by many of the church fathers that we still revere, and have never been clearly extricated from Christian consciousness. And I think we need to really do more on this. I don't know how many books I have examined on the church fathers, especially Augustine, that don't even mention this Adversus Judaios tradition, and the fact that he was, in many ways, Augustine was the father of that tradition, which really determined the relationship, not only theologically, but on the ground between Jews and Christians for centuries, literally until the Vatican II.
So, which are the most important achievements of Nostra Aetate after almost 56 years of its approval, and after this document received the signature of the then Pope Paul VI?
Well, I would say, first of all, that Nostra Aetate did have a constructive impact on the presence of anti-Semitism in Catholic teaching. It did certainly modify that teaching. It certainly was responsible for the removal of some of the most vitriolic language and in Christian theology and Christian liturgy and so on, relative to the Jews. So it did impact positively, but my argument would still be that it really hasn't led to the clear-cut and unambiguous repudiation of those seeds in the I would say the Christian community, but I would include the Catholic community. I think it really has changed the understanding of Jesus' relationship to the Jewish community of his day. Now, it didn't do it within the text of the document as such, because Nostra Aetate was one of the shortest documents to come out of Vatican II. And of course, the consideration of the Catholic-Jewish relationship, while you might argue it's the centerpiece of that document and the major reason why Nostra Aetate became a document of the Vatican II, because there was, in the initial vision for Vatican II, there was nothing on Catholic-Jewish relations or any kind of interreligious relations. And
Jules Isaacs meeting. This is the fruit of Jules Isaacs meeting.
Absolutely, absolutely.
With John the 23rd.
Now, people have argued with some credibility that in addition to the kind of consequential meeting between Jules Isaac and Pope John the 23rd, where the issue of the Jews was placed on the conciliar agenda, and Cardinal Bea was charged by the Pope to begin to develop a statement. Subsequently, as you well know, and some others, it was decided that the statement on the Jews had to be included in a wider statement on interreligious relations. And some of that was due particularly to certain bishops at the council who over the years had worked in particularly Muslim-dominated society, and in some cases had established a pretty positive personal relationship with Islam, and also urged an interreligious statement. But the most developed part of Nostra Aetate is actually the Catholic-Jewish part. But there is this transfer. It really did give an impetus, particularly the scripture scholars, to really begin to do a major turn away from the notion that Jesus was fundamentally against the Jewish tradition and teachings of his time, that he really established an entirely new religion and so on in his own lifetime. And more scripture scholars have said, no, this is not the case. Also not the case with Paul. There's been a real transformation of the understanding among scripture scholars about Paul's continued ties to Judaism in the positive sense, even as he tried to find ways of incorporating Gentiles into the wider, you might even say the wider Jewish tent. As Father Raymond Brown, one of the most outstanding scripture scholars after Vatican II, said that after much study, he had become convinced that if Paul had had a son, he would have had him circumcised. So I think Paul was portrayed as just so anti-Jewish and so on. And this got embedded, particularly with Paul, more so in the Protestant community than the Catholic community. But this kind of anti-Judaism got embedded in Christian theology and so on. And the scripture scholars, I think, sort of in part motivated and given validation by Nostra Aetate, have really moved a long way in this area. Unfortunately, their influence frequently has not reached beyond their own scholarly circles, and popular catechetical teaching, and especially even continued theological thinking in Catholicism and other branches of Christianity has really not caught on to this profound change in understanding Jesus's positive role with part of the Judaism of his day.
John, this is among theologians, among experts in Bible.
Not 100%, because some of what the scripture scholars and some of the few theologians that have taken those studies seriously, they have had an impact on Catholic catechetics, on Catholic secondary school teaching, and Catholic textbooks have changed. If you compare current Catholic textbooks over against the pre-Vatican II textbooks, there is a substantive change that has taken hold, I would say. It hasn't got all the issues, but
this could be taken as a really achievement of the process launched by Nostra Aetate. But what should we, people who are involved in dialogue, do at the present and in the future in order to produce more and more changes, in order to destroy, if it's possible to use this verb, the roots, as you said, of anti-Semitism that Christianity has in its essence, or in the writings, and part of its essence through the writings of the fathers of the church. As you said, how can we change the influence of those roots?
well, I think a strong statement of clear-cut repudiation by the Vatican would certainly in the Catholic community have an impact, an important impact. However, not a total impact. I mean, one of the things today that we need to recognize is dialogue is taking place within major changes, certainly within Catholicism, but the wider community, Christian community, or at least the Protestant community, not so much in the Orthodox Christian community, but also major changes in parts of Judaism and the Jewish community. And some of the kind of, certainly on the Catholic side, the formal statements that would come from the Vatican would not have the same impact that they once had. Now, we do have a very important statement that's actually found at the preface to the so-called fundamental agreement that was signed by the State of Israel and the Holy See a number of years ago, which established formal diplomatic relationships and formal recognition of Israel by the Vatican, by the Holy See. I have argued that while this was essentially a political document, nonetheless, it, in my judgment, it really put the final nails on the coffin of classical Christian anti-Semitism, which basically argued with Augustine that because of Jewish unfaithfulness and the punishment that would be perpetual for them, Jews could never have a homeland of their own. And I remember the late Eugene Borowitz, who was one of the early Jews on the Reform side who got involved even in theological dialogue with Christians, wrote a letter as the editor of the then Shema magazine, which he founded and so on, asking the great Karl Rahner, who was without question, if you want to name one leading theologian at the Vatican II, an influential theologian, it would be Rahner. There were others as well, but Rahner probably was preeminent. And Rahner responded in a short response that Borowitz published in Shema, just saying there is absolute, I mean, the question that Borowitz put directly to Rahner was, are there any longer theological objections by the church to the idea of a Jewish national homeland, a Jewish state. And Rahner said very clearly, no, that in a sense, that that part of the Adversus Judaeus tradition had clearly been put to rest by Vatican II. Now, Rahner never, unfortunately or unfortunately, never delved into the implications of Nostra Aetate directly, other than this kind of statement. But I think there is that. But I've tried to say this often to professional Jews who are involved in the dialogue. Don't put all your eggs in the basket of kind of official statements or official meetings in Rome, because the reality within Catholicism right now, that probably the far more influential people are the people who are teaching in Catholic colleges and universities, who are in the classroom. Many of the younger so-called Catholics are irregular attendees at Mass and so on, but they are in the classrooms. And that's where a lot of the teachings about Jews and Judaism are communicated to college students and so on, who are the future of the church. And I think that efforts like the so-called CCJR, the Council of Centers of Christian-Jewish Relations, is very important, because that's where a majority, especially of somewhat better educated Catholics, are hearing about the implications of Nostra Aetate and so on. Unfortunately, I think an awful lot of professors still who teach at that level, who are not scripture scholars and haven't really kept up with these developments I mentioned in the areas of interpretation of the scripture, interpretation of Jesus's relationship to the Jewish community of his day. I would say they probably are still the dominant, and the failure of the transfer of what the biblical scholars are saying to the realm of the theological scholars, who are on a regular basis portraying the Christian-Jewish relationship to students in the classroom, still needs a lot of work. Because my experience is that even among many so-called progressive theologians, they are not very cognizant of the implications of what the biblical scholars are increasingly presenting relative to Jesus and the Jewish tradition.
I agree absolutely with you that the most important things are teaching in the classrooms, and the things which are beyond any formalism, beyond the documents.
Right.
I wrote with the then Archbishop of Buenos Aires,
yes,
current Pope Francis, a book of dialogues. Of course, that all the opinions that Bergoglio expresses in this book is not an official statement of the church. Just very simple. He opened his heart, I opened my heart, and we began talking about without any barriers, in order not to be just polite one to the other, with a lot of respect and consideration from one towards the other, but in a free conversation. And this book really, a very simple book, but made a great impact. This book was translated into 17 languages, and in the Hebrew edition, a very known professor from Bar-Ilan University, a very important Israeli scholar, it's impressed on the cover of the book, yeah, on the cover of the book, not on, of course, on the second cover of the book is his opinions about the book, and the late president of Israel, Shimon Peres, and with very laudatory works. And I approached this professor in a meeting in the Vatican when Shimon Peres and Abbas and the Pope and Bartholomew came together on that very famous moment for peace. I asked him, I told him, you wrote such laudatory concepts about this book. Is absolutely, you feel absolutely what you express? Is this not merely a flower that you gave us? It's really your deep opinion? And he said, yes, absolutely. And it's a very serious person. And what I feel is that beyond the statesmen must be the direct, free, and sincere dialogue as we have together during this morning. Dear John, the first time that I saw you, my life was in Buenos Aires.
Right.
You remember?
Right.
You remember that the Bnei Brit. You remember in which year that was? I cannot remember.
I don't quite. I don't.
In the 90s, right? In
yes,
the 90s.
right, right.
It was.
It was the
90s.
annual conference of the ICCJ, the International Council of Christians and Jews, which that year took place in Buenos
Aires. Yes. Yes. And I remember you there. And this was our first personal meeting.
Right.
And afterwards, we met in Rome and in the meeting of the ICCJ. And let God give us much more opportunities like this one to meet, to discuss, to dream, and to try to materialize our dreams.
Well, you mentioned
an understanding.
Your great collaborator, Pope Francis, who certainly I've been working with him indirectly, writing stuff. In fact, tomorrow I have to sit down and write something for him through the COVID-19 Commission, for which I work in a small discussion group. But I sometimes remark that Francis would rather make sure that a group of visiting rabbis is given a kosher breakfast than engaging in a highly detailed theological discussion. I mean, you know, the notion of human fraternity has become so central for him. It's in the so-called famous Abu Dhabi address, but it's also in Fratelli Tutti, which is a follow-up to Laudato Si, his most important encyclical on the care for creation and so on. So this has become a central dimension of my one. I was reminded by some friends that actually when we had the ICCJ meeting in no, it was the Vatican, it was the official Ichkic Vatican meeting, which took place in Buenos Aires. Maybe that was the first place, but people reminded me that I and Bergoglio actually gave papers in the very same session. So in 215, when we had the audience with Francis in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, I brought this up to him, but he said he didn't remember. But anyway, your encounter with him is far more extensive than mine, but it was just that one session at the International Vatican Jewish Dialogue.
Dear John, thank you a lot for your time, for your memories, and till the next time.
Yes.
God, for sure that God will prepare. This is my hope. This is my pray to God, that He will prepare much more meetings between us and with others in order to bring the most important, or to try to bring the most important thing to the world, to human reality, which is the last word in the prayers, blessing in the book of Numbers. Shalom, peace. Thank you a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you.